The young ballerina sells her ballet shoes to help her grandfather pay medical bills. A former ballerina buys the pair, and an old secret is revealed, changing everyone's lives. Sophie had always been passionate about dance. From a young age, she enchanted everyone with her graceful movements, making it clear that her soul resonated with the sound of every song. At just 17, she was already considered a promising ballerina, the kind of rare talent that moves audiences with each performance. On stage, Sophie felt invincible, transported to a universe where everything seemed possible. But behind every pirouette and every leap, there was a story of love and longing that motivated her and, in some way, fueled her passion. Her grandfather, a kind and strong man who had dedicated his life to caring for her since she had lost her parents. Over the years, her grandfather had become everything to Sophie. A friend, an advisor, and her biggest supporter in her dream of dancing. He was her loyal audience, applauding every performance, whether in a grand theater or the simple backyard at home. He always smiled with a sparkle of pride and love in his eyes, encouraging her to pursue what seemed unattainable. For Sophie, these moments meant the world. Every time she looked out into the audience and saw him smiling, she felt that her dream was shared, as if she danced for both of them, carrying the love of a family that, despite the losses, was still alive in her heart. In her room, kept safe almost like a shrine, was the pair of ballet shoes her mother had left for her. The sole bore a dedication, a simple message filled with love and meaning, "For Sophie, who will always dance for us." Sophie read those words every night before sleeping, feeling the warmth of a love she had never fully known but that pulsed within her. These shoes were like an extension of herself, a symbol of her connection to her mother and the journey she felt compelled to complete. The ballet shoes held more than sentimental value. They were the charm Sophie used to face her challenges. Each time she put them on, it felt as if she were being guided by her mother's hands, as if their story continued to be written, step by step. There was a lightness and confidence in her movements, as if, somehow, her mother was holding her, protecting her from fear and uncertainty. With her grandfather's loving gaze and her mother's memories under her feet, Sophie felt invincible, a force of nature dancing not only for herself but also for those she loved. Mornings at Sophie's house were filled with simple routines but brimming with meaning. Her grandfather prepared coffee while she stretched her arms to the sound of an old radio that he kept tuned to classical music. They exchanged few words, but their looks spoke volumes. "Today is going to be a great day, Sophie," he would always say, handing her a cup of tea. She responded with a grateful smile, her heart beating faster from the certainty that he believed in her. The modest home they shared wasn't luxurious, but it was rich with memories and little details, each corner holding stories of love and perseverance. In the hallway, there was a collection of old photographs, including one of Sophie, still a child, in her first performance. The photo, yellowed with time, showed her small silhouette in a blue tutu, a shy smile on her face and a gaze full of dreams. Sophie passed by that photo daily, as if walking alongside the child she once was and the dream she had promised to fulfill. In her spare time, Sophie dedicated herself to intense training, often practicing alone until exhaustion took over her body. Her grandfather would frequently watch her from afar, in silence, as if knowing that words could not fully express everything he felt. He admired her like a master observing his masterpiece, noting each progress, each pain, and each joy that dancing brought her. To him, Sophie was the materialization of a dream he could never achieve but which had found life in the persistence and lightness of his granddaughter. There was a calmness in her grandfather's gaze, a peace that comforted Sophie on the loneliest nights. He often repeated that dancing was more than a talent, it was a gift she possessed with her whole heart, as if her mother had left a piece of her soul in the ballet shoes she had given her. These words resonated deeply within her, a constant reminder that despite the hardships, there were roots that supported her, even when life threatened to push her far from her dreams. Sophie's life seemed to be well charted, as if destiny were carefully guiding her, step by step, toward a brilliant future. But deep down, Sophie knew that the security she felt largely came from her grandfather's love and strength, who had always supported her, sacrificing himself so that she could pursue her path. And although the fear of losing him sometimes crept into her heart, she brushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the present, where they were still together, side by side, on the little journey they had built. Looking to the future, Sophie saw her life divided between her love for dance and her desire to honor her mother's memory and her grandfather's sacrifice. Those ballet shoes, with a familiar dedication, were her most precious possession, and whenever she thought of all she would face to achieve her dreams, She clung to them as if they were the unbreakable link that kept her connected to her roots and the promise of a life filled with hope and accomplishments. The day that began like any other quickly turned into a nightmare for Sophie. She had just returned from an intense morning of rehearsal when she found her grandfather sitting in the armchair in the living room, pale and with labored breathing. "I'm fine, Sophie," he tried to assure her with a tired smile, but the weakness in his voice was undeniable. Sophie felt her heart race, a wave of worry swelling within her. Without hesitation, she called for emergency help, trying to stay calm while waiting for the ambulance, though fear pulsed in every cell of her body. At the hospital, the environment was cold and impersonal, and Sophie could barely hear what the doctors were saying as they examined her grandfather. She only understood that the situation was serious, much more serious than he had let on. He held her hand with the strength he still had and tried to comfort her. "This is just a phase, Sophie. Soon I'll be home to see you dance again," he whispered with a faint smile, but she knew he was trying to hide the severity of his condition. She squeezed his hand tightly, trying to convey courage, while her eyes filled with tears she forced herself to hold back. The days that followed were exhausting and endless, with Sophie divided between rehearsals and hospital visits. Each appointment, each exam brought new expenses, and the bills began to pile up at an alarming speed. Sophie stayed up late at night, mentally going over every possible way to get the money needed, but nothing seemed viable. Everywhere she looked in the house, she saw memories of a life built with effort, and she felt the weight of responsibility increasing, almost suffocating. She couldn't let him, who had done so much for her, go through this alone. One afternoon, as she sat beside her grandfather in the hospital, he noticed the tension on her face and tried to ease her worries. "You're young, Sophie. Don't let this burden weigh so heavily on you. Just do what you can," he said with a look of understanding and affection. Sophie forced a smile, but inside she felt devastated. He had always put her first, and now it was her turn to do something for him, whatever the cost. The thought of not being able to help him faced her like an insurmountable wall, and Sophie knew she had to find a solution, a way out of the despair consuming her. As she walked home that night, the thought of the debts hovered like a dark cloud over her. Her steps were heavy, as if each movement demanded an immense effort. She remembered the times her grandfather had told her stories about his childhood, about the sacrifices he had made to care for her and ensure she lacked nothing. Now, Sophie felt it was her turn to repay everything he had done, but the weight of that responsibility seemed almost unbearable. In the suffocating silence of the empty house, Sophie looked around, searching for something of value she could sell. Her eyes wandered over the old photographs, the pieces of furniture her grandfather had bought with such effort. She knew none of this would be enough to cover the medical expenses, and the thought of parting with the house, the only home she had ever known, left her feeling groundless. Each thought seemed to lead her to a dead end, as if fate itself were testing her in a cruel way. Despair grew in her chest, a feeling of helplessness that almost made her lose control. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to calm her mind and focus on a solution, any solution. She knew that dancing was the most valuable thing she had, but how could she turn that gift into money? This was the question that spun in her mind like a storm. She considered asking for help from dance colleagues or her instructor, but shame and pride stopped her from admitting the desperate situation she found herself in. That night, Sophie sat on her bed with her head in her hands, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. The pain of seeing her grandfather suffer and the fear of not being able to help him was breaking her from within. She stood up and walked to the corner of the room where her mother's ballet shoes lay. The pair, which had been her charm for so long, now seemed to carry new meaning, as if her mother were silently indicating a difficult choice. Sophie sighed, feeling a decision forming, though fear still kept her frozen. She ran her fingers over the ballet shoes, feeling the softness of the worn material and reading, once more, the dedication inscribed by her mother. Silently, she asked herself if she could let go of that symbol of love and dreams. It felt as if the shoes were an extension of herself, a piece of her heart. But at the same time, she knew that it might be her only chance to save her grandfather. This cruel choice loomed in her mind, and Sophie wondered how life could be so relentless in demanding such a painful sacrifice. Sophie spent the night awake, sitting beside the ballet shoes as if keeping vigil over something sacred. The soft light from the bedside lamp illuminated the worn pair, revealing marks and creases that carried the history of every movement, every leap, and every fall. Her heart tightened as her fingers moved across the delicate fabric, feeling the weight of the memories and the love those shoes represented. She tried to imagine her life without them, but the very thought seemed impossible. How could she let go of the only link still connecting her to her mother? With each breath, Sophie felt a mixture of anguish and resignation. She knew that what she was about to do was the only way to ease her grandfather's pain, but the sacrifice felt too deep, as if she were giving up an essential part of herself. Closing her eyes for a moment, she recalled the times her mother watched her dance in her dreams, the look of pride reflected in those shoes. "This is for him," she murmured to herself, trying to turn the pain into strength. When she lifted the shoes, she felt the weight of the world in her hands. "You've always brought me luck," she whispered to the pair as if they could hear her, "and now, you need to bring luck to him as well." Her words came out broken by emotion, each one carrying a goodbye that Sophie didn't yet know how to say. She remembered the first day she had put on those shoes, the nervousness and excitement she felt as she stepped onto the stage for the first time. Every mark on the soles was a living reminder of her dream and her promise to honor her mother. Hesitantly, Sophie looked around the room. Everything seemed to breathe nostalgia, a silent witness to a life dedicated to dance and her love for her family. There were posters from her performances, photos with her grandfather, and the small mementos of her journey. Everything around her said that this decision was almost like saying goodbye to a part of herself. She wanted more than anything to go back, to hide those shoes, and pretend that the idea had never occurred to her. But Sophie knew she couldn't hesitate. With one last deep breath, she held the shoes in front of her, letting the light shine on them one last time. It was as if she were offering a silent farewell, one last look before letting them go. Her heart pounded painfully, but she reminded herself that there was no other choice. For the first time in her life, Sophie felt like she was dancing without music, without a stage, and without the gleam of the spotlight. It was a silent and solitary dance, where the only audience was her own heart. She sat on her bed with the shoes in her lap, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. Her fingers trembled as she traced the dedication inscribed on the sole, as if she could absorb the last essence of that love before letting them go. "Thank you for everything," she murmured, and a tear escaped. It was a thank you not just to the shoes but also to her mother, who had left her that treasure, and to her grandfather, who had always encouraged her to keep going, even in the hardest times. Before she gathered the courage to leave, Sophie looked at herself in the mirror. The reflection showed a young woman carrying the weight of a decision greater than herself. Her eyes, once bright with enthusiasm, now reflected the determination of someone willing to sacrifice everything for those she loved. The feeling was one of loss and redemption, as if she were torn between her love for her family and the pain of giving up her dream. But the decision was made, and Sophie knew she couldn't turn back. As she rose, Sophie noticed her hands were still steady, holding the pair of shoes as if they were the last anchor of her existence. She took a deep breath, drawing strength from the love she felt for her grandfather, and tried to transform her pain into gratitude. One last time, she ran her fingers over the worn stitching, memorizing every detail, as if she wanted to engrave in her mind the memory of every moment she had lived with those shoes. Finally, she turned toward the door, ready to take the next step. With a heavy heart, Sophie walked slowly out of the room, leaving behind not just an object but a piece of her own story. Each step took her closer to an uncertain future, where her love for her grandfather was the only certainty guiding her. She took a deep breath, feeling the coldness of the floor under her bare feet, and closed the door behind her, knowing this would be the last time she entered that room carrying the weight of the shoes she now left behind. The dance shop was on a busy street, discreet among old facades and bright storefronts. Sophie pushed the door with trembling hands, hearing the bell chime softly above her head. As soon as she entered, she was greeted by the familiar scent of leather and rosin, a bittersweet mixture that took her back to the early days of rehearsal, when everything was new and her dreams were still intact. She looked around, her chest tightening as she saw other pairs of shoes displayed on the shelves. Each pair seemed to tell a story, but none held the same importance as the pair in her hands. With hesitant steps, Sophie approached the counter, where a kind-faced elderly man watched her with curiosity. He seemed to understand the nature of that silent act, the weight Sophie carried as she brought the shoes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice soft and understanding, as if he already knew the reason for her visit. Sophie took a deep breath, and unable to meet his gaze, she placed the ballet shoes on the counter, letting the words come out haltingly, I need to sell these shoes." The man took the shoes gently, examining each mark, each worn spot on the fabric, like a careful appraiser who understood the life and time imprinted in every detail. Sophie watched him, feeling exposed, as if he could read each of her sacrifices etched into the soles. "It's hard to let go, isn't it?" he murmured without expecting a response. Sophie just nodded, her heart heavy. The shop owner seemed to understand that these shoes were much more than a simple item for sale. Around her, the shop was quiet, with only the subtle sounds of other dancers entering and leaving, trying on clothes and accessories, their laughter and conversations muffled by the intimate and focused atmosphere of the place. Sophie felt like an outsider in her own world, in an environment that had always been an extension of her soul. Now, however, she was a stranger, someone on the verge of abandoning her dream, leaving behind a fundamental piece of her history. As the shop owner appraised the shoes, Sophie remembered the countless times she had worn them before stepping onto the stage, feeling the thrill and adrenaline that only dance brought her. She felt a pang of nostalgia, a longing for something she hadn't yet completely let go of. The shoes were a kind of talisman, something that protected and guided her, and seeing them there in the hands of a stranger was like witnessing the separation of her and her very essence. The man looked at Sophie with a mix of understanding and respect. "They have a story, don't they?" he asked softly. Sophie nodded, holding back the tears that threatened to spill. "My mother, she was the one who gave them to me. They're the only thing I have left of her." She couldn't finish the sentence without feeling the knot in her throat tighten even more. The shop owner seemed to understand and simply placed his hand on the shoes, as if paying them a final homage. Every second, Sophie felt the weight of what she was about to do grow in her chest, but she remembered her grandfather, and the image of him in the hospital gave her the strength she needed to continue. That shop, filled with items that told stories of dreams, sweat, and overcoming obstacles, was the perfect setting for a painful farewell. Sophie knew right there that she would never again look at a pair of ballet shoes without feeling her mother's presence, like a sigh that would always accompany her. Sophie glanced at the display window, trying to find comfort in the soft light that came through the windows. Each ray of sunlight seemed to remind her of the silent promise she had made to herself to always dance for love, and now, somehow, that promise also involved sacrificing a part of herself. "It's the right thing to do," she murmured, as if repeating it would make the act less painful. The shop owner smiled gently and prepared the paperwork to complete the sale, moving with the respectful slowness of someone who understood the depth of a farewell. With one last look at the shoes, Sophie felt a strange peace mixed with emptiness. Although a part of her soul was being left there, she also knew that this sacrifice carried the weight of her love for her grandfather, the same love that had always inspired her to dance. She took a step back, ready to leave, but feeling that she was leaving behind something much deeper than an object. She was leaving the testimony of her dream in a place where, perhaps, it might find a new beginning. That same day, shortly after Sophie had left the store, the door opened again, and an elegant woman entered, radiating a presence that immediately caught attention. Margaret wore a gray wool coat draped over her shoulders, and her graying hair was impeccably pinned up, showing the discipline that dance had instilled in her over the years. As she crossed the room with firm steps, she looked around, scanning the store until her gaze settled on a pair of ballet shoes left on the counter. Something about that sight made her heart beat faster. Margaret felt an inexplicable wave of familiarity as she looked at the worn ballet shoes. They weren't new or shiny, but to her they radiated a sort of magnetism. She approached slowly, hesitant, and as she reached out her hand, she touched the pair as if afraid they might vanish at any moment. There was something about that object, something hidden in the simplicity of its state, that made her feel as though she had just rediscovered a missing piece of a puzzle she had long sought to complete. The shop owner watched attentively as Margaret held the shoes in her hands, her eyes shining with a mix of nostalgia and curiosity. He approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, and softly remarked, "A rare pair, don't you think? They were just sold." Margaret nodded, still absorbed, and then turned her gaze to the man with an unreadable expression. "Who was the owner?" she asked, her voice tinged with a melancholy she herself couldn't explain. The man hesitated before answering, as if sensing that this pair carried more than just the wear of the stage. It was a young ballerina, very talented. She said they were from her mother, a gift. Margaret felt a tightness in her chest upon hearing those words. Somehow, she knew those ballet shoes had been loved and preserved with the care that only someone deeply connected to dance could understand. An irresistible urge made her offer an even higher price to purchase them. When the shop owner completed the sale, Margaret took the shoes with the utmost reverence, almost as if she were carrying a relic. She stepped back from the counter and before leaving, cast one last look at the place, as if she were still immersed in a memory she couldn't decipher. She felt strangely moved, as if a part of her knew that these shoes were more than just a simple dance item. There was a fragment of a story in them that she, without understanding why, felt compelled to unravel. With the shoes in her hands, Margaret walked through the streets toward her dance school. With each step, she felt a deeper connection to the pair, as though an invisible thread pulled her to the past, bringing to the surface memories of her own journey. She, who had endured so many struggles in the world of dance and had abandoned her dreams at their peak, now felt that something dormant had been awakened. Those ballet shoes seemed to contain a familiar, almost intimate, energy. Upon reaching the main room of her school, Margaret sat in her office chair, placed the shoes on the desk, and observed every detail. The worn toes, the small stains, the old stitches that had withstood time, all seemed to reflect the story of someone who, like her, had dedicated their life to dance. Margaret ran her fingers over the soles, admiring the pair with an unexplainable longing, as if there was something there that needed rediscovering, something that belonged not only to that unknown young girl but also to herself. For a moment, Margaret closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember her own mother, a strict and loving dance teacher who had been her greatest encouragement. They had grown apart for reasons that now seemed insignificant, but the void of that absence had followed her for years. The feeling that something familiar had drawn her to those shoes seemed to grow stronger, as if there was a hidden message waiting to be revealed. Leaning in to look closer, Margaret noticed a subtle detail that had escaped her earlier. On the sole, amid the wear of time, was a faded inscription, something that at first glance seemed like just a stain but, upon closer inspection, revealed itself to be a dedication written in small, delicate letters. Her heart began to race as if she were on the verge of uncovering a long-forgotten truth. Margaret held the shoes carefully, her eyes scanning every inch of the pair as if unraveling a mystery. Then something caught her attention, a nearly erased mark on the right sole, something time had tried to conceal but that still held on. With her fingertips, she gently rubbed until what seemed like a smudge started to take shape. There, engraved in a familiar and delicate handwriting, were the words that made her heart stop for a moment. "For Sophie, who will always dance for us." And below, a signature she would recognize anywhere, the signature of her own mother. Stunned, Margaret let out a faint gasp, feeling a chill run down her spine. It was impossible. Her mother had left her life so long ago that these words, somehow, felt like an echo from a distant, almost forgotten past. She reread the inscription multiple times, as if needing to confirm that it wasn't a trick of her mind, a desire for reunion manifesting as a delusion. Each word brought back the warmth and firmness with which her mother had always encouraged her in dance, in discipline, and in passion. The memories came rushing in, chaotic and intense. Margaret recalled the nights when her mother, always devoted and attentive, would spend long hours by her side, correcting her posture, adjusting her steps. That signature was a part of her that Margaret hadn't seen in years, and touching it again took her back to a time when everything was simpler, before the arguments, the separations, and the silence. Now, before her, an unexpected link emerged between her past and the present. Margaret brought her hand to her mouth, trying to contain the mix of emotions flooding over her. If these shoes belonged to someone named Sophie, who could this girl be? How could she have received something that, as it appeared, had come directly from her mother? 1,000 questions flooded her mind, but none of the answers seemed satisfactory. She felt lost, like a piece of a puzzle that suddenly found itself far from the board, trying to find its place. The room, once so silent, now seemed to pulse with a different, almost spiritual energy. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing each feeling. Her mother, a woman who had taught her so much but from whom she had drifted apart due to disagreements that now seemed so small, had left a message, a legacy, in a place where Margaret would never have thought to look. She opened her eyes and looked at the ballet shoes with a mixture of reverence and longing. It was as if time had offered her a second chance, a reunion she had never expected to live. She murmured, almost unconsciously, "Mother, what does this mean?" The sound of her own voice brought her back to reality, but the connection with that memory remained alive. Margaret knew there was something greater there, something beyond the simple chance of a coincidence. The shoes, with their faded message, were a bridge to a story that she felt still needed to be told, a story that might involve more than just her and her mother. Margaret looked at the inscription once more, as if those words were clues left just for her. Her heart beat with both nostalgia and curiosity. Who was Sophie? And why did those ballet shoes, bearing her mother's signature, now belong to this unknown girl? The questions left her in a state of anguish and fascination. She felt she had to find out, that she could not simply leave this mystery behind. As if driven by an impulse, Margaret decided that her search for answers would begin right there. She clasped the ballet shoes tightly, now feeling in them a different weight, one that was not only physical but also loaded with history and sentiment. Something in her chest told her that this was the beginning of a new journey, a journey that might bring to light secrets that she wasn't even prepared to face. But at the same time, she felt that she couldn't rest until she uncovered every layer of this mystery. With a new determination gleaming in her eyes, Margaret stood up and looked out the window of her office. The shoes were still there, firm in her hands, like a link between her story and the unknown. She knew she had to move forward, that this message could not be ignored. As she looked at the faded inscription on the ballet shoes, memories Margaret had buried for years began to emerge, sharp and painful. She remembered her childhood beside her sister, a cheerful girl full of life, with whom she had shared her first dance steps. Together, they dreamed of growing up and becoming great dancers, driven by their mother's constant encouragement, who taught them with patience and passion. Dance was the invisible bond that united them, and Margaret believed nothing in the world could break that partnership. But over the years, that bond had frayed, worn down by small rivalries that, over time, turned into an abyss. Margaret had always been the more disciplined one, the one who followed every piece of advice from their mother and dedicated herself intensely. Her sister, on the other hand, had a lightness and spontaneity that made her unique, attracting attention and praise that slowly made Margaret feel inadequate. It was a silent envy, something she never admitted out loud but that grew in her heart with each passing day. Their mother, unintentionally, ended up nurturing the differences between the two, praising her sister's grace and Margaret's flawless technique, unaware that these words, meant to encourage, were planting seeds of resentment. Gradually, the sisters' arguments became more frequent, turning dance, once a shared passion, into a silent battlefield. Each performance was a competition, and the smiles exchanged backstage grew increasingly rare until only a cold silence remained. Margaret recalled one of their last rehearsals together. It was a cold winter afternoon, and they were preparing a performance for an important festival. In the middle of a difficult sequence, her sister fell, and instead of reaching out to help her, Margaret just watched her stand up on her own, hurt, without saying a word. In that moment, Margaret realized something precious had been lost, but pride held her back from acting. It was the last time they danced together. The memories grew more intense, and Margaret felt the pain of what had never been said, the apologies that had never been made. Those ballet shoes, with her mother's dedication, seemed to reignite a longing she had long tried to extinguish. She wondered what would have happened if she had chosen affection over pride, if she had embraced her sister and tried to rebuild the friendship that rivalry had destroyed. Now, all that remained was regret and a bitter desire to turn back time. It was as if her sister's ghost were there beside her, reminding her of every mistake and every choice made in the name of ego. Her sister's absence had become a wound she tried to ignore, but one that now throbbed with an irresistible force. Time, which she believed had healed all these hurts, seemed only to have hidden them, waiting for the right moment to bring them to the surface. Margaret wiped away a solitary tear, but the emptiness she felt in her chest was impossible to hide. Holding those ballet shoes, Margaret also remembered the pain her mother felt watching the two of them drift apart. She had tried countless times to reconcile them, offering advice, encouraging them to work together, but nothing seemed to work. In the end, their mother had pulled away, unable to choose a side without hurting the other. The dedication on the sole of the ballet shoes now seemed like a final request from her mother, an attempt to make peace through a silent gesture. "For Sophie, who will always dance for us." Margaret whispered the words as if they were an echo from the past, an echo of all that had been lost. She felt an urgent need to understand how those ballet shoes, which should have been part of her family's story, had ended up in another girl's hands. Who was Sophie? And why were her mother's words engraved there, a fated secret waiting to be revealed? The name, Sophie, reverberated in her mind, bringing a mix of curiosity and anxiety, as if the answer to all her questions was within reach but still hidden behind a veil of mystery. Margaret closed her eyes and, in an almost inaudible whisper, promised herself that she would seek the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She felt that somehow, these ballet shoes represented a second chance, an opportunity to confront the shadows of the past and, perhaps, find a way to redemption. The decision to investigate the origin of the shoes brought Margaret an energy she hadn't felt in a long time. Those objects, with their marks and her mother's name, seemed to demand that she move, that she return to the past in search of answers. Sitting in her office, Margaret picked up the phone and called the shop where she had bought the pair, hoping that, with a bit of luck, the owner could provide some information about the young woman who had sold them. On the other end of the line, the store owner's voice was familiar and attentive, as if he had been expecting her call. He confirmed that the pair had indeed been sold by a young woman named Sophie and, after hesitating, shared her phone number. Margaret thanked him firmly, but inside, her heart raced. The name Sophie whirled in her mind with a new weight, as if fate were conspiring to reveal something she didn't yet fully understand. With Sophie's contact information in hand, Margaret paused and stared at the piece of paper, trying to imagine who this young woman could be. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there a hidden story intertwining the past and the present in an unexpected way? Taking a deep breath, she picked up the phone again and, with a mixture of anxiety and determination, dialed the number, waiting for the young woman to answer. On the other end of the line, a young, sweet voice answered, slightly hesitant but polite. "Hello? Sophie speaking." Margaret felt a tightness in her chest upon hearing that voice, which carried an inexplicable familiarity, a tone that seemed to echo from a distant past. After a moment of silence, she introduced herself, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sophie, my name is Margaret. I'm the person who bought your ballet shoes from the dance shop. I'd very much like to speak with you about them." Sophie hesitated for a moment, and Margaret could almost feel the weight of that pause through the line. But then the young woman agreed to meet her at a cafe downtown the next day. Margaret felt a twinge of relief, mixed with a burning curiosity. She hung up the phone with a sense that something important was about to happen, as if she were on the verge of uncovering a secret that fate had carefully guarded for years. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. Her restless mind replayed fragments of memories, while she tried to imagine who this young woman named Sophie was and how those ballet shoes had passed from her mother's hands to this stranger. The questions haunted her, and the idea that there might be a deep connection between them was both tempting and terrifying. Was this Sophie a stranger or someone whom fate had brought to her like a missing piece? When dawn finally came, Margaret was ready for the meeting, though her heart was still full of uncertainty. She chose a simple dress as if, somehow, she wanted to approach Sophie with a humility that was rare in her usual demeanor. As she left home, she felt the same anxiety as before a major performance, a nervousness that only something profoundly important could cause. On her way to the cafe, Margaret couldn't stop imagining what Sophie would have to tell her. Each step seemed to take her not only toward the young woman but also toward a reunion with herself, with a story that perhaps hadn't yet fully unfolded. Upon arriving at the cafe, she sat by a window, watching the street attentively, waiting for the young woman who might change the course of her past and future. The cafe exuded the comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee beans, and Margaret focused on this familiar scent to calm herself. With each passing moment, she wondered if this meeting would bring answers or perhaps new questions. But one thing was certain: the story of the ballet shoes was far from over, and Margaret was finally ready to hear what fate had in store for her and the young woman she was about to meet. Margaret spotted Sophie as soon as the young woman entered the cafe, hesitant, with a slightly lost look, as if seeking familiarity among unknown faces. Margaret raised a hand to catch her attention, and Sophie walked toward her with cautious steps, studying the woman who seemed so mysteriously interested in the story of her ballet shoes. Once they sat across from each other, Margaret smiled gently, trying to ease the visible tension in the girl's eyes. "Thank you for coming, Sophie," Margaret began, unhurried, her tone warm. Sophie nodded and replied, "Thank you. Actually, it was a bit hard to part with the shoes. They were a gift from my mother." Sophie's voice was soft but carried a sadness that Margaret couldn't help but notice. There was a familiar pain in her words, something that resonated within Margaret as an echo of emotions she knew all too well. Upon hearing about Sophie's mother, Margaret leaned forward slightly, sensing that every word from the girl could be a crucial piece of the puzzle of her past. "Tell me about her, Sophie, about your mother," she asked gently, trying to control the anxiety growing within her. Sophie took a deep breath before responding, as if each memory weighed on her heart. "My mother was my inspiration. She gave me the shoes before she left us. She always said they brought luck and that, with them, I would never be alone." Sophie's words pierced Margaret's heart, and she felt a wave of emotion that almost took her breath away. She felt a deep connection between them, and Sophie's face, now illuminated by the soft light filtering through the cafe window, began to seem strangely familiar. As she observed the young woman's gestures and speech, Margaret started to see traits that reminded her of someone dear and distant: her sister. With a racing heart, Margaret leaned in closer, wanting to be sure of the idea forming in her mind. "And your father? Did he also dance?" Margaret asked, trying to find clues that might confirm her suspicion. Sophie shook her head. "No, my father passed away when I was young. It was my grandfather who took care of me." A look of tenderness and sadness crossed the young woman's face, and Margaret realized that Sophie shared the same solitary fate she and her sister had once faced. Gradually, the truth was revealed in layers, with each of Sophie's answers bringing Margaret closer to a revelation that seemed impossible. In a momentary pause, Margaret gathered the courage to ask, her voice trembling, "Sophie, was your mother's name Alice?" Sophie raised her eyes, surprised, her breath caught for a moment. "Yes, did you know her?" Margaret felt a surge of tears well up. The young woman in front of her was indeed her sister's daughter. Emotion overwhelmed Margaret, and for a few moments she couldn't find words. It was as if the past were crumbling and reconstructing itself before her eyes. I am her sister," Margaret whispered, her eyes shining with a mix of pain and joy. Sophie, stunned, remained silent, trying to process what she had just heard. The revelation bound them in an unexpected way, leaving both of them speechless, exchanging a long look full of understanding. Sophie lowered her gaze, trying to absorb the depth of this discovery. "Then, you're my aunt?" she asked, still incredulous, her voice wavering between surprise and emotion. Margaret nodded, reaching across the table to gently touch Sophie's hand. "Yes, Sophie, and I am so sorry that we were lost to each other for so long." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of regret and a deep desire for redemption. The bond between them strengthened in the silence that followed, a silence filled with understanding and acceptance. Margaret and Sophie were, in some way, completing a story that had begun long before either of them realized, a story marked by love, regret, and now hope. With their hands clasped on the table, they felt the bond that reunited them to a family that both had, in some way, always searched for. Margaret held Sophie's hand gently, feeling the weight of what she was about to share. The words seemed heavy, as if they had waited years to finally find a place to be spoken. "Sophie, your mother, Alice, and I, we were inseparable in childhood. Dance united us, and everything we did together." Margaret paused, looking at the young woman across from her, who watched her with attentive and emotional eyes. Each word seemed to bring Alice back, a piece of her presence that Margaret felt so vividly there in Sophie's figure. But as we grew older, things changed. Dance, which had once been a bond, eventually became a competition for us. Alice and I were different. I sought perfection, control. She, on the other hand, danced with her heart, with a freedom I never understood. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, recalling her sister's radiant eyes, the lightness with which she moved on stage. It was as if, with her eyes closed, she could see Alice there, dancing with the same grace that Sophie now carried. Sophie listened in silence, absorbing each detail, as if learning about a side of her mother she had never known. Margaret felt a pang in her chest at the sight of her niece's pained eyes, knowing that the story was as new for her as it was for herself. Over time, this difference became an abyss. We argued, said things that should never have been said. Alice drifted away, went her own way, and out of pride, I didn't go after her. I thought that, with time, she would come back. Margaret's voice faltered as she recalled the moment she realized her sister wasn't coming back, that the silence between them had become permanent. "It was a mistake, Sophie. A mistake I could never correct. The last time I saw your mother, she was leaving and she didn't say where she was going." Sophie squeezed Margaret's hand, as if understanding and compassion overflowed in that simple gesture. For both, it was as if the painful past were gradually being transformed into something lighter, something they could carry together. Margaret allowed herself to smile, a mixture of sadness and tenderness filling her eyes. "These ballet shoes, Sophie, seeing them made me remember everything. How we danced together, how we dreamed of the future. And it made me realize how much I erred in letting her go." She took a deep breath, looking at Sophie with a new determination. "And now here you are. Part of Alice, part of me, and maybe a chance to fix what I let slip away." Sophie, still holding her aunt's hands, shared a few memories of her mother, the tender moments and the stories Alice told about her own love for dance. "She always told me that one day I would understand what it meant to dance with the heart. That dance was a heritage, something that isn't taught but lives within us." Margaret listened to each word with tear-filled eyes, recognizing in Sophie's stories the same advice her mother had once given her, counsel that now seemed to have passed through generations to reach her there before her. The cafe around them seemed to fade as Margaret and Sophie talked, connected by a story that, though full of sorrow, now seemed to be reborn. The two shared memories, laughed at the stories Alice told, and found comfort in each other, realizing that they both carried the same love for the woman who had departed. For Margaret, it was as if Sophie brought Alice's presence back, a second chance to love and protect her sister indirectly, through the young woman now before her. Finally, Margaret took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Sophie, I know this story is full of missing pieces, but I want you to know that from now on you won't be alone. I am here for you. And maybe we can find a way to honor your mother together." Sophie smiled, moved, and an invisible yet strong bond united the two in a way they both knew would last forever. Margaret looked at Sophie with a mixture of affection and admiration. Every gesture, every word from her niece reminded her of her sister Alice, but also revealed something unique, a genuine talent and a sparkle that belonged solely to Sophie. Touched by the young woman's story and her determination to help her grandfather, Margaret felt the desire to do something more, something that could truly change Sophie's life. The idea, though simple, emerged in her mind like a spark. Perhaps this encounter was, after all, a reunion planned by fate. "Sophie," Margaret said, her voice gentle yet firm, "I'd like to offer you a full scholarship at my dance school." Sophie's face lit up, surprised, and she blinked, trying to absorb what she had just heard. "You have a rare talent, something very few people have," Margaret continued. "Your mother would be proud to see how far you've come, and I would be honored to be part of your growth as a dancer." Sophie, her eyes wet, looked at her aunt in disbelief. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret smiled, holding the young woman's hands tenderly. "More than ever, my dear. I want you to have all the opportunities you deserve. At my school you can develop your talent, achieve your dreams. And I will do everything I can to help you get there." The emotion on Sophie's face was evident. That proposal wasn't just a chance to study dance. It was the promise of a new beginning, a new family, and the support she had so greatly needed. But Margaret didn't stop there. "I would also like to help with your grandfather's medical expenses," she said, with a determined gleam in her eyes. "He is your family, Sophie, and now he's mine too. If I can do something to ease that burden, it's the least I can do." Sophie could barely believe what she was hearing. It was as if, in a single meeting, her life had transformed from a lonely and uncertain reality to a future full of love and possibilities. She felt embraced in a way she had never imagined, as if what was happening there was healing a past she hadn't even known was incomplete. I don't know how to thank you, Aunt," she stammered, wiping away a tear running down her face. Margaret simply squeezed her hands, saying with a smile, "There is nothing to thank, Sophie. You are part of me and of Alice. It's what your mother would have wanted me to do." The sense of security wrapped around Sophie like a warm hug, something she hadn't felt since she lost her mother. It was as if at last she had a place, someone to trust and with whom to share joys and challenges. She knew the road would be difficult, but now she was no longer alone. There was someone who not only believed in her but was also willing to walk by her side, offering her a chance to grow and overcome the obstacles she faced. Margaret watched her niece, feeling that the void she had carried for so many years was finally being filled. The young woman in front of her brought new hope, a new purpose. The love she had always wanted to give her sister now found a place in Sophie, who seemed to receive that affection with an open heart. It was as if, together, they were rebuilding the bridges of the past, one step at a time, with the promise that this bond would never be broken. "So, Sophie," Margaret said, taking a deep breath, "from now on, let's walk together side by side. I want you to feel part of this family. And that, when you're ready, you can carry our family's name to the stage, with the same passion your mother had." Sophie nodded, moved, feeling a deep gratitude. Now, more than ever, her dream of dancing became a mission of love and heritage, something larger than herself. And so, in that cafe between confidences and promises, Margaret and Sophie sealed a new beginning. On the first day of training at the dance school, Sophie felt the weight of everything that was to come. The studio was larger and more rigorous than any place she had rehearsed before. The other dancers, all with years of experience, watched her with curiosity and perhaps a bit of skepticism. Margaret accompanied her discreetly, keeping a distance so Sophie could find her own space, but her aunt's presence was a constant support, a reminder that she was no longer alone. The first rehearsals were difficult. Sophie struggled to keep up with the pace of the more experienced dancers, but the steps, which had once felt natural, now required much more of her. Her technique was good, but Margaret knew that her niece would need something extra to stand out there. "Remember to dance with your heart, Sophie," her aunt would say after each rehearsal, recalling Alice's words. "Don't just think about the movements, feel what they mean." Sophie, though frustrated, nodded, knowing that she was facing the greatest challenge of her life. The school's routine was intense and unforgiving. The classes demanded precision, strength, and endurance, and each week Sophie felt her body more exhausted but also stronger. Gradually, her natural talent began to shine, and the teachers noticed her potential. Margaret silently observed each step forward, proud to see Sophie transform. It was as if, with each new step, The young woman was dancing not only for herself but also for her mother's legacy and the love of her family. In the mornings, Margaret made a point to arrive early to watch Sophie's practices. Her aunt's attentive and proud gaze filled her with motivation, and even on the most difficult days, that family bond gave her the strength to continue. With each rehearsal, Margaret saw a bit of Alice in her niece, the same dedication, the same intensity. But Sophie was also unique, and her dance, though marked by traces of the past, had an authenticity and passion that were hers alone. The teachers began to notice Sophie's progress and started giving her more challenging roles in the school's performances. But it wasn't just her talent that made Sophie stand out. Her resilient spirit, born from the difficulties she had faced, made her a distinct dancer with a presence that moved everyone. Margaret could see that her niece was blossoming, not only as a dancer but also as a strong and determined young woman who was finally finding her place. During breaks, Sophie and Margaret would talk about dance, about Alice's past, and about the journey they were on together. Each conversation, each laugh and confidence, brought a feeling of healing to both. Margaret felt the weight of guilt slowly dissolving, replaced by a new hope. And Sophie, in turn, felt that she had finally found the family she had always sought, a bond of love that strengthened her as much as her rehearsals. As the months went by, Sophie felt more confident, more complete. The movements that once challenged her became natural, and the dance flowed from her with a freedom that only those who have endured great sacrifices can understand. Margaret watched Sophie's performances with a light heart, seeing her shine in a way that made every sacrifice worthwhile. In Sophie, Margaret saw the future of her family's dance, a legacy that had been dormant for so many years. The other dancers began to respect Sophie, recognizing her effort and dedication. Though she had started as an uncertain newcomer, she had become an inspiring figure, a dancer who danced with her heart. Margaret, watching from afar, knew that Alice would be proud of her daughter, who had now become a talented young woman, ready to face the world with the grace and determination inherited from her mother. And so, Sophie continued on her journey, finding in the studio not only a place to grow as a dancer but also a space to solidify her bond with Margaret. Each training, each new achievement, and each conversation between them cemented a relationship no longer defined by the past, but by love and mutual trust. The night of the gala had finally arrived. Sophie observed the backstage with a mix of anxiety and excitement, feeling the magnitude of the moment. The school was filled with guests, families, and friends of the students, all eager to watch the show. The lights on the stage cast a soft glow over the red velvet curtains, and the lively murmur of the audience brought a comforting warmth to the space. Sophie took a deep breath, remembering everything that had brought her to that point, her mother, her grandfather, and now her Aunt Margaret. Backstage, Margaret watched Sophie with silent pride. The young woman, dressed in an elegant white costume, seemed to radiate a light that echoed Alice's gentleness and strength. For Margaret, it was like reliving memories of her sister, but at the same time she knew that this was Sophie's night, the moment she would shine with her own essence, no longer a shadow of the past but a new beginning. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Sophie," Margaret said softly as she gently tucked a strand of hair behind her niece's ear. Sophie smiled, touched, and embraced Margaret. "Thank you, Aunt. I'm only here because of you and Grandpa. You both were my strength." Margaret returned the embrace with affection, feeling complete as she watched the young woman prepare for such a significant moment. That moment between them was a silent promise that, despite everything, dance and love had reunited their family once more. "Dance for all of us, Sophie," Margaret whispered, her eyes wet with emotion. In the audience, Sophie's grandfather sat in the front row, a tearful smile on his face. Although his health had weakened him, he had insisted on being there to see his granddaughter fulfill the dream she had fought so hard to achieve. Beside him, other members of the school and important guests waited eagerly for the performance. As the lights dimmed and the theater fell into silence, Sophie's grandfather clasped his hands, waiting for the moment she would appear on stage. With the lights turned toward the stage, Sophie took her first steps under the spotlight. The music began to play, a soft and enveloping melody, and Sophie allowed her body to surrender to the sound, dancing not just with technique but with all the love she carried in her heart. Each movement was a silent tribute to her mother, to Margaret, and to her grandfather, those who had given her what she needed to be there, on that stage, transforming pain and resilience into something beautiful and intense. As she danced, Sophie felt completely connected to her mother, as if she could feel her presence beside her, smiling and applauding. There was a deep peace guiding her steps, a sense of belonging that made each movement authentic, as if the dance were an extension of her deepest emotions. And in that moment she understood what her mother meant about dancing with her heart. There, on that stage, Sophie was the living legacy of a story that transcended time. Margaret, watching from the wings, felt her heart overflow with emotion. With every leap, every spin, she saw not only the talented dancer Sophie had become but also the strong and loving woman Alice had always wanted to create. Sophie represented a cycle of healing and resilience, a new hope that now shone more brightly than ever. Margaret discreetly wiped away a tear, knowing that that night was a consecration not only for Sophie but for the entire family. As the performance reached its climax, the audience remained in absolute silence, enchanted by Sophie's intensity. Her movements were precise, yet charged with a passion that captivated every spectator. Her grandfather, his eyes filled with tears, watched his granddaughter, feeling proud and grateful to be there, witnessing the fulfillment of a dream he and his wife had always wished for their daughter and now for their granddaughter. When the music ceased and Sophie struck her final pose, a wave of deep silence washed over the theater. For a moment, it was as if the world had stopped, with everyone holding their breath. Then a single clap echoed, followed by an explosion of applause that seemed endless. Sophie, her chest still heaving, looked out at the audience and saw her grandfather's emotional smile and Margaret's proud gaze in the wings. She knew then that she had found her home. When Sophie finally left the stage, the theater was still trembling with the sound of applause. The audience was on their feet, clapping warmly and endlessly, as if they wanted to make the moment last forever. Standing in the wings, Sophie was still breathing heavily, her heart pounding with the intensity of the performance she had just given. The glow in her eyes reflected not only the triumph of the stage but the victory over all the pains and sacrifices she and her family had faced to get her there. Margaret was waiting for Sophie just behind the curtains, with tear-filled eyes and a smile brimming with pride. When she saw her niece approach, she couldn't hold back the tears she had been keeping inside for so long. It was as if, in that moment, all the past sorrows and years of separation had been dissolved by the power of the love reborn that night. When Sophie came close, Margaret pulled her into a tight hug, a simple gesture yet loaded with silent promises, forgiveness, and renewal. "You were magnificent, Sophie," Margaret whispered, her voice choked, holding her niece's hands and looking her in the eyes. "Your mother would be immensely proud of you. And I am honored to see you fulfill this dream." Sophie, also moved, simply smiled, knowing that words couldn't capture everything she felt. She embraced Margaret with a peaceful heart, feeling at last that her family was whole again, that the past had been redeemed. On the other side of the stage, Sophie's grandfather was waiting for her with a look of pure joy and satisfaction. When she saw him, Sophie ran to him, and he wrapped her in an embrace overflowing with love and pride. "You made it all worthwhile, my girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother and I always knew you were special." Sophie held her grandfather's hands tightly, feeling that this moment was the realization of a dream not only for herself but for all who had loved and supported her. Later, still basking in the atmosphere of the performance, Sophie, Margaret, and her grandfather gathered in the theater's small lobby, where friends and colleagues congratulated them warmly. For Margaret, that moment felt like a late yet precious reward. The pain of loss and the years of separation had turned into gentle memories, for she now had the opportunity to share the family's love with Sophie, and she felt grateful to welcome the young woman into her home and her life. Sophie, with a smile that expressed everything words could never convey, looked at Margaret and her grandfather. She knew that night marked a new chapter in her life, but this time without ghosts from the past. With her aunt's and grandfather's support, she could now pursue her path as a dancer, carrying with her her mother's legacy and her family's story of resilience. More than ever, she was determined to honor that heritage with every step she took, on every stage she crossed. Gradually, the theater emptied, and the small family headed home under the soft light of the night. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding that transcended words. Margaret felt that, by finding Sophie, she had rediscovered a part of herself that she thought was lost forever. And Sophie in turn knew that from that moment on, she would never be alone. She had a home, a history, and a family that, though marked by pain, was now renewed in a deep and unbreakable love. In the months that followed, Sophie blossomed as a dancer, becoming not only a respected artist but also a figure of inspiration and courage for her peers. Margaret supported her every step of the way, proudly helping her build a path that honored not only dance but Alice's memory. For both of them, dance had ceased to be a mere dream and had become the bridge connecting their souls and their stories, a true inheritance of love. And so, with the stage illuminated by the echoes of an unforgettable performance and their hearts finally reconciled, Margaret, Sophie, and her grandfather continued their lives. United by bonds that distance and time had nearly severed, they supported and cared for each other, ready to face the future with the certainty that love, though it may be lost and broken, always finds a way to be reborn and to blossom, like a dance that never ends. If you enjoyed Sophie and Margaret's incredible story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any upcoming videos. If you love touching stories and want to support our channel so we can continue bringing you quality content, consider contributing via Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your support is essential to our improvement. Thank you for your support. See you in the next touching story.